1. The joke. The first thing Commander Zale Vreth did when his scout ship broke through the upper atmosphere of the third planet was laugh. It was not a quiet laugh. It was not a polite, diplomatic, carefully contained expression of amusement. It was the full, unrestrained, chest-heaving laughter of a being who has just seen something so profoundly ridiculous that all pretense of professional composure simply collapses. He laughed the way his father had laughed at the primitive water crawlers of Dendus 4, the way his grandfather had laughed at the bark scratchers of Mevros Prime, the deep, generational laughter of a species that had spent 3,000 years watching lesser civilizations fail to even understand the sky above them. "Command," he said, composing himself enough to key the broadcast. "I am sending you the preliminary atmospheric scan of Sector 7G, third planet from the Star Soul. Indigenous species present. Classification." He paused, pulling up the biometric readings. Soft tissue bipeds. No external armor. No venom glands. No regenerative capability. Estimated average body mass, 80 kilograms. Locomotion, 2 limbs. Primary sensory organs, exposed and unprotected. He glanced at the visual feed. They still use fire. The laughter on the fleet channel was instantaneous and total. 47 warships, 200,000 Vreth soldiers, all of them laughing. Zale smiled and leaned back in his command chair, watching the pale blue marble rotate slowly beneath him. It was, he had to admit, a pretty planet, green and blue and white, with enormous oceans that caught the light like polished silver. The dominant species had built structures on approximately 30% of the landmass, crude things, mostly, though a few of the larger ones showed a rudimentary understanding of vertical engineering. They had vehicles that burned fossil fuels. They had primitive electromagnetic communication networks. They had, he noted with considerable amusement, pointed chunks of metal that they fired at each other from a distance. They fight each other, he broadcast, pulling up the conflict pattern data, with projectiles, small ones. Another pause. They have been fighting each other with projectiles for approximately 400 years and have not yet managed to kill themselves entirely. More laughter, richer this time, the kind that comes with disbelief. Zale keyed in the formal assessment protocol and began dictating his report. The Vreth Empire had a process for this. Every new species got a classification assessment, an official determination of threat level, resource value, and recommended handling protocol. In 3,000 years of expansion, the Vreth had classified 11 species as Tier 1 threats, 42 as Tier 2, several hundred as Tier 3, primitive but potentially useful as labor populations, and a category so low it didn't even have a formal tier designation, simply labeled in the old tongue as Vreth, which translated roughly as the ones who did not matter. Zale looked at the biometric data, looked at the primitive weapons, looked at the atmospheric composition analysis showing significant self-generated pollution, looked at the conflict data showing a species so fractured it couldn't even stop fighting itself long enough to notice the fleet of alien warships in its upper atmosphere. He typed, "Classification Vreth." He hit submit. He laughed again, softer this time, with a sort of fond condescension, the way you might laugh at a child who had drawn something genuinely terrible and presented it with tremendous pride. "Do you want us to announce ourselves?" His second-in-command, Orth, asked from the adjacent console. "Standard contact protocol?" Zale considered this for a moment. Standard contact protocol existed for civilizations that might pose a challenge. Species you wanted to assess before engaging, or that had resources worth preserving through negotiation rather than force. For Vreth-class worlds, the protocol was simpler. Land. Assess physical resources. Determine labor viability. Report. No contact protocol, he said. Vreth class. We'll do the standard survey. Tell the resource teams to prep for atmospheric descent in 6 hours. Understood. Zale turned back to the viewport and looked at the pale blue marble one more time. He thought, briefly, of the 47 species that had come before this one. Species that had looked up at Vreth ships and screamed, or prayed, or sent desperate transmissions that translated to variations of the same theme. Please, we have families, we have history, we built things, we love things, we're more than you think we are. He thought of all the civilizations that had begged, and he thought of how none of it had mattered. Because that was the truth of the universe. The iron law that the Vreth had proven across 3 millennia of expansion. Power was the only language that mattered, and these soft-skinned, fire-using, self-fighting little creatures on their beautiful blue rock had none of it. He closed his eyes. He went asleep. He never gave humanity another thought. Part 2. 72 hours. The flagship Vreth Empire, 3 kilometers long, crewed by 12,000, armed with enough firepower to render a small moon uninhabitable, was gone by the morning of the second day. Not destroyed. The Vreth would have understood destroyed. In 3,000 years of conquest, they had lost ships before, and they had a vocabulary for that, a formal category, a way of processing and moving forward. Destroyed meant the ship was in pieces. Destroyed meant there was debris. Destroyed meant you could look at the wreckage and understand, at least, what had happened. The Vreth Empire was simply not there anymore. One moment it existed, confirmed on 17 separate sensor arrays across the fleet, logged, cataloged, the steady thrum of its engines detectable from 600 kilometers. And then, without warning, without any preceding sensor anomaly, without a single weapons discharge from the planet below, it was gone. Like a candle pinched between 2 enormous fingers. Like a word erased from a page. Zale was on the bridge of his own ship when the alert came in. He stared at the empty space where his flagship should have been for a full 12 seconds before he managed to speak. Run the sensor check again. We have run it 11 times, Commander. Run it again. The sector of space where the Vreth Empire had been was simply empty. The stars behind it were visible. The light that had been partially blocked by 3 kilometers of warship now passed through unimpeded, as though the ship had never existed at all. Contact the surface, Zale said. His voice was very quiet. I want to know what happened. There was no response from the surface. Not a refusal. That would have been understandable. That would have meant something. Just silence. The electromagnetic communication channels that the humans used were still active. They could detect the traffic, the chatter of a civilization going about its business, but nothing came up to meet them. Within the hour, Zale issued the order to begin weapons lock on the primary population centers. It was a standard intimidation protocol. The Vreth had used it hundreds of times, with the same result: panic transmissions, desperate negotiation attempts, local authorities falling over each other to offer surrender. Nothing came back from the surface. Not surrender, not defiance, not fear, just silence. On the morning of the third day, one of the smaller patrol vessels near the planet's northern pole reported contact with an unidentified object ascending from the surface at high velocity. The vessel locked weapons, demanded the object identify itself. The object did not respond. The object docked with the patrol vessel. 14 minutes later, the patrol vessel's senior crew transmitted a single line, requesting immediate command consultation. Priority absolute. Zale ordered them to send whatever they had found to him directly. What arrived in the transmission bay of his command ship was a single data chip, Vreth formatted. He noted, with a chill he couldn't quite rationalize, that it was Vreth formatted correctly, in the precise military encoding standard used by their fleet, and on the chip was a single file, a blueprint of the Vreth Empire, accurate to within millimeters. Every system, every weapon array, every power coupling and life support junction and command architecture, the entire ship laid out in perfect technical detail. At the bottom of the blueprint, in clean Vreth military script, was a notation that read, "We thought you might want this back. We made some improvements. You can find the new version at the following coordinates." The coordinates were on the planet's surface. In 72 hours, humanity had taken a 3-kilometer warship, studied it completely, reverse-engineered every system, and begun building their own version. Zale sat with the blueprint in his hands for a very long time. He was not laughing. Part 3. The Thing About Humans. The Galactic Council convened in emergency session 31 days after the disappearance of the Vreth Empire. Ambassador Yaravel of the Kethri Compact was the one who formally requested the session, and she was the one who stood at the podium before 312 species and tried to explain what had happened. She was not entirely sure she understood it herself. The Vreth Empire, she said, dispatched a fleet of 47 vessels to the Sol system, third planet, approximately 6 weeks ago. The planet is home to a species designated human, also called Homo sapiens. Based on their initial assessment, the Vreth classified the species as Vreth, lowest possible threat classification. The chamber was quiet. Everyone knew what Vreth meant. Everyone in that chamber had spent their political careers learning to hope they were never classified that way. Within 72 hours of the fleet's arrival, Yaravel continued. The Vreth flagship had been removed from orbit, disassembled, studied, and was being reproduced in modified form in a human manufacturing facility in the northern continent of the planet's largest landmass. She paused. Within 5 days, the human military had reverse-engineered and adapted 14 distinct Vreth weapon systems. Within 8 days, they had begun modifications to those systems that our own weapons analysts describe as, she glanced at her notes, considerably more efficient than the original design. The murmuring in the chamber was growing. Within 14 days, she said, raising her voice slightly, the human government formally transmitted a message to the Vreth fleet. Not a surrender, not a negotiation request. She pulled up the message on the main display. A list. The display filled with text. Alien scripts in dozens of languages. Names, planetary names, species names, the designations of civilizations both living and dead. This, Yaravel said, is every species the Vreth Empire has ever classified as Vreth. Every world they have ever burned, harvested, or reduced to a labor population. Every name that has been, in the official records of the Empire, erased. She let the list scroll. It was very long. The humans found these records. We do not know how they found them. The Vreth archival systems are among the most secure in the known galaxy. But they found them, and they compiled this list, and they sent it to the Vreth fleet commander with a single accompanying message. She pulled up the message. It read, "You will read every name on this list, out loud, on a broadcast frequency receivable by every civilization in this sector. You will not stop until you have read every name." This is not a request. The chamber was completely silent. The Vreth fleet commander, Yaravel said softly, complied. It had taken 11 hours. 47 warships sitting in orbit around a pale blue planet, the most powerful military force within 300 light years, reading the names of the dead into the void. Every species they had erased, every world they had burned, every civilization that had begged them to remember and been told that it did not matter. Humanity had made them matter. The question before this council, Yaravel said, is not whether humanity is a threat. The question that I believe we all need to sit with, is what kind of species does what they did. She set down her notes. They didn't destroy the Vreth fleet. They could have, I think. Our analysts believe they could have. They had the weapons. They had the tactical intelligence. The way they dismantled and studied the flagship suggests a level of strategic capability we genuinely did not anticipate. But they didn't destroy them. She paused. They made them remember. Part 4. What Zale understood. Commander Zale Vreth returned to Vreth Prime, a broken soldier. Not broken in the way his people understood. Not defeated in battle. Not physically diminished. Not stripped of rank or honor in any formal sense. He had done exactly what the humans demanded. And then, when they lowered their weapons and opened the corridor through which his fleet could leave, he had left. He had filed his report. He had told the truth, every word of it, because lying would have been worse than useless. Someone else would go to the Sol system and find the same thing, and the only outcome of lying would be more Vreth dying for no reason. His report was classified level absolute within 6 hours of submission. He was called before the Grand Council within a week. "You are telling us," the first speaker said, his voice carrying the precise, controlled contempt that Vreth High Commanders reserve for things they found genuinely incomprehensible, that a Vreth-class species, a species we classified as the lowest possible threat level, a species that still uses chemical combustion for transportation, took the Vrethcaden apart and rebuilt it in 72 hours. Yes, and you complied with their demands. Yes, because you believe they could destroy the fleet. Zale was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to say what he had understood in those cold, silent hours orbiting the blue planet, reading name after name after name into the darkness. "No," he said finally. "I complied because I understood, at that point, that destroying the fleet was not what they wanted." He looked at the first speaker. They wanted something much more specific. And I understood, when I received their message, that they had already thought about this situation far more carefully than we had. "Explain." "The Vreth Empire has been expanding for 3,000 years, Zale said. In that time, we have developed a very specific model for how civilizations respond to us. They see our ships. They panic. They try to fight or they try to negotiate. They fail. They submit." He paused. "That model is built on the assumption that civilizations respond to power with fear. And every civilization we have ever encountered has done exactly that." He was quiet for a moment. "Until this one." The first speaker was silent. "They were not afraid," Zale said. "I want to be very precise about this, because I think it matters. They were not pretending to be unafraid. They were not suppressing their fear in order to project strength. They genuinely did not appear to be afraid. They looked at 47 warships in their upper atmosphere, and they were." He searched for the word. "Interested." They were interested. They took the flagship apart the way a naturalist takes apart an insect. Carefully, completely, with the specific intention of understanding how it works. He looked at his hands. "And then they sent us the blueprint, not as a threat, but as a message, as a demonstration. They wanted us to understand what they were. What they are," the first speaker said coldly, "is a problem." "No," Zale said. "What they are is the first species in 3,000 years that has made us read the names." The silence in the chamber was different from the silence he had experienced on the bridge. That silence had been the silence of confusion, of a worldview cracking under unexpected pressure. This silence was something older and heavier. The silence of an empire beginning to understand something about itself that it had, for 3,000 years, successfully avoided understanding. "There were 612 names on that list," Zale said. "I know because I read all of them. Some of them I recognized. The Dendari, the Mavrosian bark scribes, The water shepherds of Pellis. Species I have learned about in history. Species that were used as examples in military academy. Species that we discussed as evidence of our own capability and power. He looked around the chamber. I had never, not once in my life, thought about what it meant that they were gone, that they had existed, that they had built things and loved things and had names for themselves in their own languages. He was quiet. The humans thought about it. They found the records we buried and they read every single one of them. And then they made us say the names out loud in front of the galaxy so that no one could pretend anymore that those civilizations hadn't existed. This is philosophy, the first speaker said. We are discussing a military threat. No, Zale said again. We are discussing something we have never encountered before. We are discussing a species that weaponized memory, that understood, instinctively, that the worst thing you can do to an empire built on erasure is force it to remember. He stood. That is not a conventional military threat. That is something else entirely. And if we send another fleet to that planet without understanding what it is, we will lose more than ships. Part 5. The Archivist. Her name was Dr. Amara Osei, and she had spent 14 years in a basement. Not literally, though it sometimes felt that way. She was the senior xenolinguistic archivist at the Global Cultural Preservation Institute, a title that sounded prestigious and was, in practice, the academic equivalent of being the person responsible for making sure things that nobody living remembered were not permanently lost. She worked with dead languages, extinct cultures, civilizations that had vanished so long ago that even their neighbors had forgotten them. She was very good at finding things people had tried to hide. When the alien fleet had appeared in the upper atmosphere, when every government on Earth had gone into emergency mode, and the military had quietly, efficiently, professionally dismantled the alien flagship before anyone outside the inner circles had fully processed that first contact had occurred, it was Amara who had been quietly contacted by a 3-letter agency and asked a very specific question. We have the ship's data core, the man across the table had said. We can read the files. We need someone who can understand what we're looking at. She had looked at the alien text on the screen and felt, for the first time in 14 years of digging through the ruins of forgotten civilizations, the specific electric thrill of something being found. This is an Imperial archive, she said. We know that. No. She leaned forward. This isn't just military records or mission logs. This is their entire Imperial historical record. Everything they've ever classified, cataloged, conquered. She looked at the man. Every species they've ever encountered. Every world. She had slept 3 hours in the next 4 days. The archive was staggering in its scope, and once she understood its organizational logic and its horror, the Vreth, she learned their name from the earliest files, had been methodical. They cataloged everything. Every civilization encountered, assessed, classified. Every Vreth-class species had its own file. Initial assessment, resource survey, and then, in a final column labeled with a Vreth word that translated, she had discovered with her hand shaking as completion status a binary notation. Present. Or erased. She found 612 species in that column marked erased. Some of them she could find almost nothing about, even in the archive. Just a name, a star system, a brief description, and that final notation. Others had more. Descriptions of their architecture, their biology, fragments of their languages that the Vreth had recorded for classification purposes and then apparently never looked at again. One species, small amphibious beings from a water world in what humans called the constellation Lyra, had, according to their file, spent their last transmissions trying to teach the Vreth surveyors their music. The surveyors had recorded it for the archive. The music had been sitting in the archive, unlistened to, for 900 years. Amara had listened to it 3 times before she could stop crying. She had compiled the list herself. She had formatted it in every language she could reconstruct from the archive fragments, so that each name appeared, where possible, as the species would have written it. She had sent it up through channels with a single accompanying note. Make them say the names. She had not known if anyone would listen to her. She had not known what would happen. She had known, with a bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent her life recovering what other people try to bury, that it was the right thing to do. When the broadcast came back, when she sat in her basement office and listened to a Vreth commander reading the names of the dead into the darkness of space, 11 hours of it, name after name after name in a voice that started flat and professional and ended somewhere much more complicated, she had not felt triumph. She had felt something she didn't have a word for, something that lived in the space between grief and relief, between the weight of what had been lost and the fragile, tentative possibility that losing it had finally been witnessed. She turned off the broadcast when it ended. She sat in the dark for a while. Then she opened a new file on her computer and began writing. There were 612 civilizations, she wrote. This is what we know about each of them. It would take her 11 years to finish the book. Every species on that list got a chapter. Some chapters were long, civilizations with rich archive records, with fragments of language and art and architecture that she could painstakingly reconstruct into something like a portrait. Some chapters were short. A name, a star system, a handful of physical facts. But every one of them got a chapter. Every one of them got to be remembered, as fully as the evidence allowed. She dedicated the book to the Waterworld musicians of Lyra. Part 6. What the Galaxy Learned. Humanity's formal entry into the Galactic Council was, by all accounts, the strangest diplomatic event in recorded interstellar history. They arrived with no warships. They arrived with no military delegation at all, which caused a minor panic among the security protocols of approximately 40 attending civilizations who had spent considerable resources preparing for a species that had defeated the Vreth fleet. They arrived with 3 diplomats, a xenolinguist, and a historian. The historian was Dr. Amara Osei, 22 years older than she had been in the basement. She had gray at her temples now, and she walked with the slight deliberateness of someone who had spent decades sitting in poorly lit rooms and was comfortable with that. She carried a physical book, an actual paper and ink book, which caused its own small sensation among species whose civilizations had moved entirely to digital media, and she set it on the table in front of her without ceremony and waited. Ambassador Yaravel, who had requested this meeting and had been waiting for it for more than 2 decades, looked at the book and then at the woman and said, carefully, "Is that the full record?" Amara said. "All 612. We printed it. We thought it should be a physical object." She paused. Things have a way of getting deleted. There was a long silence in the chamber. Then the delegate from the Pellis Waterworld, one of the civilizations that had survived their Vreth encounter through luck and geography rather than military capability, rose from their seat. They said something in their own language, something that Amara's translator rendered as the ones who were not forgotten. They bowed. They sat back down. Their shoulders were shaking. The human delegation had come with no demands, no territorial claims, no resource negotiations. They had come with what Yaravel later described in her memoirs as the most disarming diplomatic opening I have ever witnessed in 40 years of interstellar politics. They had come to share the archive. All of it. Every record the Vreth had kept. Every file in that vast imperial catalog, offered freely to every species in the Council. Not as leverage. Not as a threat. Not as a demonstration of what they had been able to extract from the flagship's data core, though the implication of that capability was not lost on anyone in the room, simply as a gift, because the records belonged to the people they described, and those people deserved to have them. Yaravel had asked, afterward, in private, the question she had been turning over for 22 years. Why didn't you destroy them? The Vreth. You could have. We've had analysts looking at this since it happened, and the consensus is that you had the capability once you had their weapons technology. Why the list instead of a war? The lead diplomat, a quiet man named Kwame Asani, who had the patient eyes of someone who had thought about something for a very long time, looked at her for a moment before answering. Because destroying them would have ended the problem, he said. Making them remember meant they had to live with it. And that's worse. For an empire built on the premise that the things you erase don't matter. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, considerably worse. Yaravel sat with that for a moment. There is something else, she said. Something I've been trying to articulate for 2 decades and haven't managed yet. She looked at him. Your species, your classified Vreth. Lowest threat level. In 3,000 years of Vreth expansion, every species classified Vreth had been correct. They were low threat. They were unsurprising. And you surprised them. You surprised everyone. She shook her head. We have been trying to understand what we missed. What the Vreth missed. How a species at your apparent level of development was capable of what you did. And I think I have part of the answer. The weapons engineering, the tactical intelligence, those things we can analyze and understand. But the other part. She gestured vaguely. The list. The names. The decision to do that instead of simply winning. That is not a military calculation. That is a moral architecture. And I don't know where it comes from. Kwame was quiet for a long time. We have been erasing people for most of our history, he said finally. Our own people. Different groups, different centuries, different justifications, but the same basic mechanism. Deciding that certain people and certain histories didn't matter, burying them, moving on. He looked at his hands. We got very good at recognizing what that looks like. What it costs. What it leaves behind. He paused. I think that's where it comes from. We recognized what the Vreth were doing because we had done it to ourselves. And we knew, because we had lived with the consequences of doing it to ourselves, that the worst thing you can do to someone who has decided certain people don't matter is make those people matter as loudly as possible. Yaravel was silent for a long time. That is, she said finally, a terrible thing to have learned. Yes, he said. It is. Epilogue. The last lecture. Centuries passed. The Vreth Empire did not fall immediately. Empires built over 3,000 years have a great deal of structural inertia, and the humiliation of a single fleet. Even a humiliation as thorough and public as the reading of the names does not by itself dismantle the architecture of power. But something had changed deep in the Vreth cultural substrate, and the change was slow and irreversible and could not be stopped by classified reports or official silences. The names had been read. The galaxy had heard them. And in the years after, the species that had survived their Vreth encounters, the ones classified Tier 3, used as labor, kept alive in diminished forms on their diminished worlds, began, quietly, to ask for their names to be said too. The Vreth, in the end, did not burn them. That option had become politically untenable in a way it had never been before, because the galaxy was watching now, and the galaxy had a record, and humanity had demonstrated in clear and unmistakable terms that buried things had a way of being found. The empire contracted. Slowly, over centuries, the territories that had been taken were returned, or the populations within them were given the right to self-determination, or negotiations were opened that had never been possible before, because one party had always simply assumed it could kill the other. It was not clean. It was not fast. It was not, in any sense, a fairy tale ending. There were wars and setbacks and civilizations that had been diminished too severely to fully recover, and histories that existed only in Amara Osei's book because the people who had lived them were gone. But the names had been said, and that meant they were real, and that meant they mattered. And in a universe that had spent 3,000 years practicing forgetting, that was something. The last lecture Zale Vreth ever gave was at the Galactic Council's new Academy of Interspecies History, an institution that had not existed before the reading of the names, and would not have existed without it. He was very old by then, far past the age at which most Vreth commanders remained active, his crest pale and his movements careful. He stood before a classroom of mixed species students, young Vreth alongside young Pellis water speakers alongside the grandchildren of species that had once been classified Vreth, and he told them what he remembered. He told them about the laughter. He didn't spare himself. He told them how easy it had been, how natural, how completely untroubled by doubt. The certainty of a species that had never been wrong about what strength looked like. He told them about the empty space where the flagship had been. He told them about the blueprint arriving in his transmission bay, accurate to the millimeter, with a note that said we made some improvements. He told them about the list. I have thought about that list for a very long time, he said. I have thought about why it was worse than a weapon. Why reading those names was harder than anything else that happened in those 4 days. Harder than understanding what they had done to our flagship. Harder than accepting that we had been strategically outmaneuvered by a species we had classified as irrelevant. He looked at the students, and I think I understand it now, though it took me most of my life to get there. A young Vreth student in the front row asked, "What do you understand?" Zale was quiet for a moment. That the names were not a weapon, he said. They were a mirror. The humans showed us something we had done, something we had been doing for 3,000 years, efficiently and professionally and without any particular malice. And they showed it to us in a form we could not dismiss or minimize. 612 species, not abstractions, not resources, not problem solved. Names. He paused. The specific, individual names of specific, individual peoples who had existed and built things and had languages and music and ways of understanding the world that were now gone because we had decided they didn't matter. The classroom was very quiet. The humans understood something about power that we had never understood, he said. They understood that the most dangerous thing a powerful civilization can become is one that has decided certain things don't matter. Because once you've decided that, you've also decided that you don't need to look too hard at what you're doing. And if you don't look too hard at what you're doing, he stopped. He looked at his hands. You went up with a list like that. The young Vreth student was quiet for a moment. Were you afraid? She asked. When they showed you the list. No, Zale said. Then, more honestly, yes. But not of them. I was afraid of what the list meant about us. He looked at her. That is the correct thing to be afraid of. That is what they understood. And that is why, and I want you to remember this, that is why they're the only civilization that has ever made the Vreth change. He sat down. The lecture was over. Afterward, in the corridor, a small human student, an exchange student from Earth, soft-skinned, no claws, carrying a battered copy of Amara Osei's book under her arm, stopped beside him and looked up. Do you think it was worth it? She asked. Everything that happened. The long way it took. All ends.